You know, discussing how an artistic movement gets created in a certain time period, in a certain culture, is honest to God, I think, one of the most fascinating topics and subjects that can be explored. Because you've got to think about it. No artist exists in what they call a vacuum. Every artist that you've ever perhaps been into, every film that you've ever liked, every song you've ever heard has a time and a place and a country and a language and a culture that it came out of. And we might want to deny some of these aspects. We might not understand some of the aspects. You know what I'm trying to say? Because we can't see them clearly for what they really are, especially until many years have gone by sometimes, you know? But they always exist. Always. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, Madonna is a product herself of the time period she came from, obviously. And Jimi Hendrix, another. We're going to focus on Jimi for a little bit here because he's one of my favorite artists of all time. Now, when you're looking at Jimi Hendrix and how this was created, how the hippies in general were created, and we know that Jimi Hendrix is deeply associated with the hippie movement, with the anti-Vietnam protests, and all that stuff that happened in the mid to late 60s and the early 70s. Now, when you're looking at that, there's lots of questions to ask. I mean, who created all of this? And the truth is obviously that Jimi Hendrix himself is a response to a certain society, to a certain type of ruling class, to a certain type of president, to a certain type of atmosphere and environment and culture. And it's actually kind of hard to swallow the next bit of information, but the somewhat sad, twisted, but even maybe beautiful truth is that without the conservatives of his time period, in other words, without the war hawks, without this really macho military that was like insisting on fighting in Vietnam, without this super sort of violent backdrop, you know, without the war in Vietnam, without all that sort of stuff, and yes, maybe even without, we could include without racism, does Jimi Hendrix ever actually manage to be born and exist the way we know him? In other words, does this beautiful music ever manage to get created? Now, this is really a hard pill to swallow for a lot of us, I think, because we kind of have to almost give a type of strange credit to the enemies of this awesome music. Because we know that at that time, there definitely existed serious enemies who hated this hippie music. They hated Jimi Hendrix. They hated psychedelics. They hated the whole peace thing. They hated the beatniks, they were called. They hated flower power. That's, you know, it sounds kind of silly nowadays, but it was called flower power. And they hated long-haired guys who were becoming hippies and wearing, you know, leather vests with the fringe and trying to go to California to score for Sid. They hated these people. And they were trying initially, before the hippie was born, before the hippie movement began, we know that the conservatives were trying to get these people into this massive draft, literally a war draft, send them out to a foreign country far away to die in Vietnam. And that sounded really frightening. But what I've always thought was really interesting, you see, for instance, when I was growing up as a kid in the early 2000s and kind of the late 90s, I was very deeply exposed to classic rock right away. You know, I got real into Hendrix way back then as a 12-year-old in like 2001 or whatever it was. And then I was really into the Doors. Those were like my first two big artists, sort of. Jimi Hendrix, the Doors. And then I would have the artists of my own time. And it was strange because a lot of the artists of my own time were actually obsessed with violence. Really, they were obsessed with like a lot of kids that I knew, they loved like hardcore metal, and it was always really super aggressive. It was really obsessed with violence, and it almost sounded like the sort of music you would in fact listen to if you were marching off to a war. I just made this comment last night at my job, for instance, because one of the immigrants is this Latino guy, and I guess he plays drums, and he wants to start a metal band. And he's like 30 something, maybe he's even 40. Like, he's pretty old, and I guess he had a metal band in his old country he lived in, Peru or wherever it was. And he said he loves metal, so he's always blasting metal as he's on his shifts. And I said, dude, this sounds like music from a guerra, from a war. And he's like, oh yeah, I love it. It gets me so pumped up. And we know, of course, that metal has been popular for years. But you see, the irony of metal is, why didn't they create it? Why didn't those kids create metal back in 1968 when there was actually a fucking military war draft? You see the strangeness here? In other words, maybe metal wouldn't be so popular if tomorrow there was another draft. Because then all of a sudden, everything changes. When there was a draft, all the kids, all the youngsters, we'll call them, were obsessed with creating music about peace and love and flower power, and hugging the trees, and wearing fringed leather vests, and making this psychedelic sort of music. And then when the war went away and was no longer a problem, and the hippies successfully got rid of the draft, and the Vietnam War actually ended in 1975, and world history went on, after a long enough time, that threat goes away, and suddenly you kind of see metal is born. Metal is born during peacetime. Okay? I find that really, really interesting. And I really do find myself often wondering what direction music might go in if we were to have another terrible situation like that on our hands. I also have to admit that I find it rather interesting, if we go even further back in history, to think about the fact that, sometimes you think about the music that those really frightening soldiers would have been listening to in the German Wehrmacht. That was one of the elite forces, I think, in Hitler's military, the Wehrmacht. And when you imagine the music those men listened to, those really harsh, brutal soldiers, in one of the most brutal conflicts of all human history, and they were the enemy, right? They're the enemy. And they're really scary. And when you imagine the music they listened to, as a modern person, I have to admit that I almost sort of picture them listening to metal or something. Right? You almost, I'm not going to lie, I sort of associate them with a really hardcore metal band like Rammstein, who sings those hard metal songs in German. But of course, we know that no such music even existed for the German Wehrmacht. Now, that becomes really interesting, because this sort of destroys an argument that is famous amongst people who are anti-metal. So people who were anti-metal over the years used to always kind of say the same thing, right? What did they used to say? I think everyone remembers. Hey, this really loud, aggressive metal music pollutes the minds of children, and it makes them more violent. It's going to make adults more violent. It's going to destroy our whole society if we keep allowing people to listen to this really hardcore music. And there are a variety of criticisms that I could toss at metal, especially because my sympathies have always gone more towards early punks in the mid to late 70s, the early 80s, and it's also gone towards the hippies. I have a lot of sympathies for the hippies, and I had many disagreements with punk friends over the years due to how much I personally adored the hippies. But putting all that aside, let's just face the facts here. The most violent military force in human history, if we are to say that was the German Wehrmacht during the Second World War, existed and did all these atrocities, committed genocide, did absolutely barbaric, horrific things, spilt so much blood of innocence, almost destroyed the world as we know it, and they didn't have any music or soundtrack to go with them. They were literally listening to fucking Mozart and Bach. Just think about that. So you don't often think about, like, what were these people listening to? What was inspiring them? The people in the German Wehrmacht were literally listening to Mozart and fucking Beethoven and Bach, and they went off and did that. Like, there's that famous scene, I think, they even did try to throw this into Schindler's List, right? I think there's a famous scene where, like, one of the commanders in the German military in the movie sits down in some house that they're raiding and just starts playing this incredible music on the piano. And what the filmmaker, I suppose, was trying to show to us was that oftentimes these people who start these wars and these commanders, these higher ups, they're going to be the sorts of people who were in fact raised with those upper class sensibilities. They're the types of people who do play Bach and Mozart and Beethoven on their pianos. They know how to do that sort of stuff. I mean, let's never forget, Hitler was a fucking artist. He was fucking deranged. He was an artist of, actually, he was quite conservative in terms of the art that he produced, wasn't he? He didn't really do anything too different. He produced very sort of, I think most people would look at it, and say it was rather boring, because he didn't try to do anything different with his art. So and that's not to say that through this boring art that he created, you can predict the atrocities that he's going to go on to create, but it's just to say, like, he was a conservative, I guess, the whole time, and he didn't even try to experiment with his art or anything. Versus, you look at what Pablo Picasso was doing around the same time, and he was experimenting all the time. He was very what they call avant-garde. And yeah, I don't know. It's just really, like, weird when you try to connect art to political stuff, because a lot of the times we want to believe that it doesn't connect, but the fucking truth is that it does. You know what I'm saying? Like, I really like the blues music that was created in the Deep South. And the unfortunate truth, of course, if you like blues music, if you like studying the history of blues music, Howlin' Wolf, Lightning Hopkins, Robert Johnson, there's all these big names of these black bluesmen who lived in the Mississippi Delta and stuff. And everyone who studies and digs blues music understands, of course, that the unfortunate truth is that this beautiful music could have never been created if there had not been, behind the scenes, in the scenes, segregation. So no one is saying that if you listen to blues music, it's because you dig segregation, but we understand that it wouldn't have existed if that backdrop hadn't have been there. Because music always pops up to fight something. And it's just sort of weird because we don't really know how to feel. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for music? Does it mean that these conservatives are accidentally inspiring art? Because that's a very fascinating theory in a way. They're accidentally inspirational. Because usually, think about the word inspirational. When someone says, "You're very inspirational to me," or "That was very inspiring to me," usually it's applied in a positive way. You'd say, "Oh, wow, that was a deeply inspiring moment in my life." And it would mean, like, usually I think it means something was positive. But to say that, some specific artist was inspired by the atrocities that occurred after the World War, or Jimi Hendrix was inspired by the vicious magnitude of the Vietnam War and the draft, sounds bizarre. But the truth is that he was. And we know that he probably would have never been that obsessed with peace and love, and he probably would have never made those cool songs about, like, rainbows and the Beatles with the Marmalade Skies and all that sort of psychedelic stuff would have never happened if that Vietnam War had never happened. So it kind of helped art, even as much as we hate to say that. Now, it's not to say go start another Vietnam War tomorrow and we're going to get back peace and love music and it's going to be fantastic and we're going to have the next Hendrix. But, I mean, you're just left to wonder. The truth is that the great heroes of music and art will pop up. They'll always pop up. We've learned that now, I think. I hope many of us have learned that throughout history. You know, you can. I always remember this line that I heard in a great punk song by a band called The Pissed. So they were always pissed. And he said, you know, we know how you operate. We've witnessed your attacks, but we're in it till the end. Yeah, no retreat, no turning back. And that song is called Ideas Are Bulletproof. And it's basically about how, you know, you can't kill an idea. I'll read the lyrics now, because some of them are very good. Because the conservatives always think that they're going to be able to, like, root something out or get rid of something, and they never ever succeed. They never succeed. They might succeed for like 20 years, but it eventually always comes that like something slithers out from the underground and changes everything. Just like Hendrix, you know, they could have never actually gotten rid of him. So yeah, it says here, you might think that through violence we can be shut down. And you might stop us physically, but the ideas will be around. You think our hopes will be forgotten when we're dead and gone. But just like Martin Luther King, the dream will still live on. Eradicate the woman, exterminate the man. We've watched you throughout history employ your master plan. And then there's the line I remembered. We know how you operate and we've witnessed your attacks, but we're in it till the end. Yeah, no retreat, no turning back. And here's probably the best verse that he wrote for The Pissed. Ideas are intangible. They are beyond your grasp. They constantly resurface, though their origins have passed. We fought an uphill battle. We fight to right your wrongs. You might have beaten us for now, but we'll come back twice as strong. And we really do see this again and again throughout history, that the forces of good, in my opinion, are never entirely defeated. They will always pop up again. Whatever you imagine those forces of good to be. I mean, it is sort of in each person's individual imagination too, by the way, I think. You know, because I mean, I imagine that the forces of good, I'm waiting still for that next Hendrix. That was my great hero of history, Jimi Hendrix, you know, the psychedelic music, the great rock, that really inspirational sound. I've never heard anything like it again. That was my favorite. I guess he really is probably my top 5 favorite artists. Like when I listen to him, I just feel great. And I've never found anything that quite connects to that. So I guess over the years sometimes I've wondered, maybe I'll only hear it again if something really terrible happens for about 5 years, and then after it's over, whatever that terrible thing is, like a war, maybe after it's over I'll hear something that's that deep and inspiring again. Right? But yeah, that's the talk. That's the talk. Just think about how art is created and what it's connected to.